Right, here we go again with Fossilbuster. Now, this is a second series of videos which I'm going to create to do with inspiration, because I think inspiration is a better word than motivation. You definitely need to be motivated if you're going to learn a second language, but you need more than motivation. You need inspiration from wherever you can get it. So what I'm going to do is to tell you about how I was inspired to learn Spanish as a second language. And a good mentor of mine is Vladimir Skenderov, whose link will be below. And he suggests that if you want to learn something, you simply find someone who can do it and then you copy them. I agree with him. It's as simple as that with language. So here's my story as an offering, and you can, if you feel like you want to copy it, well, great, try it out. It certainly worked for me. Now there are two types of inspiration. There's intrinsic motivation, or inspiration, which is not so common, really. It's what you're passionate about, really passionate about. And there are, a lot of people go through life and they're not actually passionate about many things. But you will meet people who are passionate about certain things. And in my case, I was always passionate, I think, about language right from a fairly early age. I remember being at high school and being absolutely appalled at how bad the teaching was. And this is not to criticize my poor parents, who are no longer here to defend themselves, but they sent me to that school with very good motives. But certainly the pedagogy was terrible. They really didn't know how to teach. They didn't know how to explain things. So I realized at an early age that being able to explain things clearly was an important skill. And I became interested in it. And so then at university, I remember being asked to do a presentation. And this was my first presentation, so I was terrified. And it wasn't full of high-powered biology. That was my subject at the time. But I do remember explaining quite clearly the process. It was to do with plant genetics. Anyway, at the end of the presentation, people did make the comment that the explanations were clear. And I was so motivated, thrilled by this feedback, that it inspired me to think about becoming a secondary teacher, a high school teacher, instead of a PhD student. And that's a decision I've never regretted, actually. So anyway, I was always kind of interested in simplifying the complicated. That's been my, I guess, my epitaph. If I will ever have an epitaph, it is, he tried to simplify the complicated. Because a lot of things are so complicated, and the teacher's job is to simplify it. So that's what I tried to do. Now, the other type of motivation, which is much more common, of course, is extrinsic motivation or inspiration. That's where something outside of yourself inspires you or motivates you. And the classic example of this is you want to learn a language to get a job. Okay. Now, in my case, I remember that I'm just going to tell you two stories about this because I don't want the video to be too long for you. My first story is about my first job in Ghana, where I was a volunteer teacher for 2 years, in 1975. And I remember arriving there as an intellectual, nerdy young man, and but full of ideals and idealism, and having to teach these very enthusiastic young Ghanaian students. Science, as it was in that time. I was originally a science teacher for 10 years. So after about 3 weeks, I was thrilled with the response I was getting from the students. And the reason was this, because the students were very happy with me because I turned up to class. Now, many of the teachers in Ghana, unfortunately, they were not paid well, so they had to supplement their income on their farms, and quite often they were absent from class working on their farms. And so the fact that I turned up every day was a great bonus for my students. Anyway, after about 3 weeks, two students came to me and they said, "Sir, we just wonder, would you be able to give us extra class in the evenings?" So I said, well, yeah, okay. There wasn't that much going on, I must say. It was the rural part of Ghana. There was no telephone, no television, and there was no internet. So yes, I thought, well, why not do that in the evenings? So I went along to the class that evening, and all 38 of my students were standing waiting for me. I couldn't believe it. Now, I just found this such a thrilling and motivating experience. It's such an inspiring experience. In fact, the whole of the 2 years was in Ghana, and not just because of the students, but the people in general. I just found the reception I got to be so inspiring. So this inspired me to teach. Now, the other great source of inspiration for me in learning a language in particular was learning Spanish. And I learned Spanish way back in 1982. I was about 32 at the time, and I was in Manchester, in England, at a university there, and I was studying in a postgraduate course, and I was in a postgraduate building there which was full of overseas students. Very interesting to me. So one evening I was watching the news and I was chatting to a Mexican guy there, and we chatted away, and he invited me up to his room afterwards for coffee, and we started chatting about Mexico and Spanish, and he seemed to be keen to teach me Spanish, and I seemed to be immediately captivated by this idea, and I liked the sound of the Spanish, and I thought, yes, I'll learn this language. Let's do that. So, of course, having decided that I had an intrinsic interest in learning the language, it was a very powerful motivation. But how was I going to do it? Because my experience of learning languages had been appalling. I had learned French at this awful high school I was at, and the French had been presented in the most dry, dull, and boring manner, with just exercises and little readings, and almost zero speaking of French in the class, and nothing about the culture at all. So it was absolutely contextless. Awful. 6 years of it, and I did develop some sort of passive vocabulary, but my active vocabulary was zero. It almost still is. But I had 6 years of it. And then I had even worse experience with Latin, which for some reason was compulsory. And this language, it wasn't even spoken. So again, the teaching was dry and boring without context. And anyway, another 6 years of that. So I wanted to learn Spanish 25 years or 20 years later. How was I going to do it? Well, I didn't know any other way except to do the way I had been taught myself. So I went down to the bookshop, found an old primary school grade 1 primer, opened it, took it back to the residence, and every day I did one lesson, starting off with greetings, then shopping, then eating, and so on. You know, each little chapter, you know how it is. They have a little picture, they have a little piece of text underneath it, then they have a little piece of grammar, and then they have some exercises. Anyway, what else could I do? That's the way I've been taught, so I taught myself in the same way. 45 minutes. But then afterwards, of course, I would go up and have coffee with Louis, my friend. And yeah, we would start chatting, and he would make it much more interesting, and he would talk about ports and talk about Mexico, and yeah, and music, and it became real. So it was still very slow progress, as you can imagine. Even after 9 months, after the course was nearly over, I couldn't speak. So anyway, I could listen though, and I'd read a fair bit. So I was developing some passive vocabulary. Anyway, at the end of that year, my friend said, look, you're not sure what you're going to do next year? Why don't you come to Mexico and stay with my friend? And, well, actually not his friend, his sister and mother in their house. Yeah. So I thought, oh, well, okay, that sounds pretty good to me, really. All right, I'll do that. So, cut a long story short, that's what I did. I took a flight to Vancouver, and I hitchhiked down the west coast, and I arrived in Mexico City. Now, this was about a year after I'd started learning the Spanish. So I was appalled at what happened in Mexico City. I couldn't speak a word to my friend's sister who met me. My friend actually stayed in Manchester for a while, so I didn't see him in Mexico. And I just had to try to speak to his sister and to his mother and his sisters and in the family. And it was such a struggle. I remember in Mexico City, the first encounter with his sister, she was in an apartment block about 10 stories up, shouting in Spanish, speaking quickly to me, saying hello, welcome, and all that. And I had the clue. I've still got the picture in my mind of that scene. It was so traumatic because I couldn't say anything. Anyway, we took a long bus journey to Yucatan, which is where my friend's family lived. And to cut a long story short, that is where I lived for the next few months. And though that family in that little town of Valladolid, in those days, you're talking now 40 years ago, was a very small place, and there was not a soul who could speak English in his family, nor in the whole town. Because I promise you, if I had found one person who could speak English, I would have found them and spent some time with them, trying to speak English with them, just to relax. That's how powerful it is, a draw. But there was nobody. So I had no option, no choice, but to be totally immersed. So what I did was, in fact, it was very hot, and I slept in a hammock. I would wake up in the morning, have breakfast with the family, and it would just be hello, good day, gracias, yes, thank you. And I would just listen to the whole family, and of course, it was terrible. They must have thought that I was so rude because I couldn't participate. But it was very good for my listening. So by the end of the meal, I'd be exhausted, tired, and I would go back to my hammock and have a nap. And then I would wake up again, and I would turn on the television, and I would watch for an hour and a half, just listening. I'm not hardly following anything at all, just listening in Mexican television. And then it was lunchtime, and we had another trauma at lunch, trying to struggle along with the family. And then after that, I would go back to the hammock again and need another sleep, a siesta. So then I would wake up, and then I would go out and buy the newspaper. And I would buy a newspaper, and I would read for an hour and a half, not understanding hardly a thing, looking at photographs mainly and so on. Well then, of course, in the evenings, I happened to play cards, because my friend's sister organized cards with her friends, who were mostly females, luckily for me, and one of them was a very interesting female who later became my wife. So very quickly we fell in love, and then of course she couldn't speak a word of English, and I was still just managing phrases and sentences. So we had a routine where I did what I told you during the day there, and she was off working, and she'd come back in the evening, and during the day I would write her a letter, and that was my writing practice. And then we would talk about the letter, and then okay. So that's the story really. And in fact, I suppose I really should tell you the next best part of the story was that these ladies, in fact, had already planned before I arrived to go to Cuba for a trip, and out of politeness they asked me to go with them, thinking I would say no, according to my wife, but of course I said yes. Anyway, when we came back from that trip, Maria and my wife and I or at least I was ready to propose to my wife. And so I stayed in Mexico then for about a further 9 months, met my wife's mother and so on, and then we moved to Ireland, in fact, because I needed to get a job. I was going to get married. Maria couldn't speak English, and so I was going to be the earner for the first years of our marriage. And in fact, I got a job offer in Colombia in South America. And very soon after getting married, my first son was born in Colombia. I spent 2 years in Colombia. And I thought that would be a kind of gentle... my wife had never been outside of Mexico before, but I thought Colombia would be similar to Mexico. So we decided to go there. And we had a great time. And of course, I then had to use that language. It was a bilingual school. I used it with teachers, in staff meetings and so on. I had to use it. I had to speak to some of the teachers who couldn't speak English. And slowly I became really quite fluent. And I'd say, after about 3 years from meeting my friend in Manchester, I was really pretty fluent in speaking and reading and listening. But I agree, not in writing, certainly not. Okay. Anyway, I just hope that you've enjoyed this video. I wanted to give you my story because it just shows you the importance of total immersion. All the skills were there. There was very little self-instruction, just my little bit in Manchester at the beginning, which was only the very beginning where I was teaching myself. But most of the rest of it was through total immersion. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the story. I'll be back with more soon. Please leave your comments on this video. If you want to contact me, you'll find my address in the description below.